Welcome back to Curious Potter. Tonight, we are not changing a battle. We are changing a piece of paperwork, and then we are going to watch what paperwork can do to people who have already lost everything. At 3 in the morning on the 2nd of May, 1998, the Ministry of Magic was almost empty. Almost. On the 4th level, in a corridor lined with filing cabinets that stood taller than a grown man, one witch was still at her desk. Her name does not matter yet. What matters is what she was doing. Everyone else had run. The Death Eaters who held the building had heard that their master was at Hogwarts, and they had gone to him or gone to ground. The clerks who had kept their jobs by keeping quiet had taken their coats and left through the visitors' entrance. The lamps in the corridor had burned down to a low blue. This witch did not run. She opened the 3rd drawer of the 9th cabinet, and she took out a folder that was thick with parchment and soft at the corners from being handled. She set it on her desk. She dipped her quill. Then she drew one careful line through the title on the cover, and above it, in small neat letters, she wrote a new one. She blew on the ink to dry it. She put the folder in her bag. She went home and slept for 4 hours, and at 8 o'clock she came back to work because she believed that somebody had to. 400 miles north, at that exact moment, Kingsley Shacklebolt was still alive and still standing and still winning. The Great Hall at dawn was not a room anymore. It was a place where a room had been. The house tables were shoved against the walls, the enchanted ceiling showed a grey sky going pale, and the floor was covered in rubble and glass, and people who would never stand up again. In the middle of it, 3 duelists were fighting one. Minerva McGonagall fought the way she taught, precisely, with no wasted movement. Horace Slughorn fought better than anyone would have expected of him, because Horace Slughorn had spent 60 years being underestimated and had learned to use it, and Kingsley Shacklebolt fought like an Auror who had survived a war and did not intend to lose a second one. Voldemort was faster than all 3 of them. He moved through their spell work like a man walking through tall grass. He was enjoying it. That was the thing about him that nobody who had not seen it could quite believe. In the middle of the ruin of his own plans, with his snake dead and his followers scattering, Lord Voldemort was enjoying himself because 3 of the most skilled adults in Britain could not touch him. McGonagall drove a silver arc of light at his head. He turned it aside without looking. Slughorn came in low and clever from the left. Voldemort broke that too. And then he answered all at once, with a single spell that came out of his wand the color of old bone. In the war we know, that spell threw all 3 of them backwards across the floor, and they got up. That is the moment. That is the one thing that goes differently. It is not a dramatic difference. It is a matter of about 6 inches. McGonagall was thrown clear. Slughorn was thrown clear. Kingsley Shacklebolt was half a step further forward than the others, because he always was, and the spell caught him square in the chest. He did not fly backwards, he simply stopped. For a moment he stayed standing, and his wand was still raised, and his face had the mild, surprised expression of a man who has remembered something he meant to say. Then his knees folded, and he went down onto the rubble without a sound, and he did not move again. Voldemort did not even watch him fall. There were other people to kill. And so the battle went on, exactly as it should have. Molly Weasley fought Bellatrix Lestrange over her daughter, and won. Neville Longbottom pulled a sword out of a hat and took the head off a snake. Harry Potter threw off his invisibility cloak in front of a hall full of people and told a room that he was alive. The rest you know. 2 boys in a broken hall, 1 disarming spell, and a wand that had never truly belonged to the man holding it. Voldemort fell in the middle of the floor, and it was ordinary, and it was over. Harry Potter was 17 years old, and he had won. 9 people carried Kingsley Shacklebolt to St. Mungo's Hospital that morning, because nobody was willing to trust him to fewer. The healers laid him in a bed on the 4th floor and began the work of finding out what had been done to him. They never did find out. Voldemort had invented spells the way other men wrote letters. He had made magic that no book contained and had taught it to nobody, because teaching it to somebody would have made him less than unique. whatever had left his wand at dawn on the 2nd of May was his own work, and its author was dead on a stone floor in Scotland, and there was no one alive to act. Kingsley did not wake. He did not worsen either. He lay in a private room with the curtains half drawn, and his chest rose and fell, and a healer came in every 4 hours and tried something new, and nothing happened. The healers used the word coma because they had to use some word. Privately, the senior healer on the ward wrote in her notes that the patient appeared to be waiting. This mattered far more than anyone realized at the time, and here is why. The Ministry of Magic had no government. Pius Thicknesser, who had held the office of minister for the last year, had spent that entire year under the imperious curse, which meant he was both innocent of everything and useless for anything. Every senior official appointed under him was under investigation. The Wizengamot, which was the court and the Parliament of Magical Britain at once, had lost its chief warlock when Albus Dumbledore died and had never replaced him, because the man who would have replaced him was Voldemort's puppet. There was one obvious candidate to hold the country together. There always had been. Kingsley Shacklebolt was an Auror with an unbroken record, a member of the Order of the Phoenix, and a man whose voice on the wireless during the occupation had kept thousands of people from despair. If he had walked out of that hall on the 2nd of May, he would have been Minister for Magic before the week was out, and nobody would have argued. Instead, he was on the 4th floor of St. Mungo's, breathing quietly, and Magical Britain had to find somebody else. They had 30 days. The old emergency statute was clear on that point. Within 30 days of a vacancy in the office of minister, the Wizengamot was required to appoint an interim holder, or the ministry's authority would lapse entirely. And in a country that had just been through a civil war, nobody wanted to find out what that meant. 30 days is not very long to choose a government. It is more than long enough to choose a wrong one. The first name they tried was Arthur Weasley. It was a good name. He had worked at the ministry for 25 years. He had fought in both wars, and he had never once in his life taken a bribe or told a comfortable lie. On the 9th of May, his name was put before the Wizengamot, and for about an hour, it looked as though Magical Britain was going to get lucky twice. Then the counting started. 50 chairs sit in the Wizengamot chamber, arranged in tiers around a stone floor. On the 9th of May, 11 of those chairs were empty because their occupants were dead. 6 were empty because their occupants were in holding cells awaiting trial. 4 were empty because their occupants had fled the country. That left 29 witches and wizards to decide who would govern. 29 people who had all just survived something. 29 people who were frightened and exhausted and looking for someone to blame. And a good number of them looked at Arthur Weasley and did not see a decent man who had fought a war. They saw a member of Dumbledore's private army. They saw a man whose family had been at the center of every disruption of the last 7 years. They saw someone who was personally close to Harry Potter, and after a year of being ruled by a man with a private cause, the surviving Wizengamot had developed a horror of anybody with a private cause. Arthur Weasley lost the vote by 4. He took it well, which is to say, he went home to the burrow, where his wife was sitting at the kitchen table with a folded jumper in her hands that she had knitted for one of her twins, and he decided that he had lost nothing at all that day. The Wizengamot tried again on the 14th. They needed somebody with no cause, no faction, and no enemies. What they found was Elphias Doge. If you have never heard of Elphias Doge, that is rather the point. He was very old. He had been at school with Albus Dumbledore and had spent the 60 years since telling people so. He had been a member of the original Order of the Phoenix, which meant he had genuinely stood up when standing up was dangerous. He wore a hat that had been fashionable in about 1940. He had a wheezy voice and watery eyes and an enormous capacity for believing that things would probably turn out all right. He was, in short, a thoroughly decent man, and he had never in his life run anything larger than a subcommittee. Elphias Doge was appointed interim minister for magic on the 14th of May, 1998, by a vote of 23-6, and he wept a little when they told him, and he said that Albus would have been so pleased. Then he walked into the minister's office on level 1 and found 4,000 things that needed deciding by Friday. Here is the thing about a ministry. It is not the minister, it is 9,000 feet of corridor and 10,000 filing cabinets and several hundred people who come in at 9 o'clock and go home at 6 and know exactly where everything is kept. A new minister who understands that can run the place. A new minister who does not understand it gets run by it. Under normal circumstances, the people who had spent the last year processing Voldemort's paperwork would have been swept out of the building. That is what Kingsley Shacklebolt would have done, and he would have done it in his first fortnight, and he would have done it thoroughly, because he had spent his career learning that the dangerous ones are rarely the ones with the tattoo. Elphias Doge did not sweep anybody out. He looked at the mountain of work in front of him, and he looked at the tired staff who had turned up to help him with it, and he was grateful. He kept almost everyone. He announced this as a policy of national healing and was applauded for it in the Daily Prophet. Among the almost everyone was a witch from the 4th level named Ophelia Trask. She was 41 years old. She had joined the ministry at 18 as a records clerk and had never worked anywhere else. She had no dark mark, no arrests, no known politics, and a personnel file so clean it was almost boring. During the occupation, she had run the records office of the Muggle-born Registration Commission, which is to say that when Dolores Umbridge's commission dragged Muggle-born witches and wizards in front of a panel and asked them to prove they deserved their own magic, Ophelia Trask was the person who filed the results. When she was questioned about it in the last week of May, she answered every question fully and calmly. She said that she had never sat on the commission, never given evidence, never signed a committal order. She said she had kept the records. She said that if she had refused to keep the records, they would have found somebody else to keep them worse, and the names would have been lost, and nobody would ever have been able to prove what had happened to whom. The investigating panel found that there was no case against her. Reading her testimony now, it is hard to say they were wrong. She was promoted in the first week of June to senior undersecretary to the minister because she was the only person on level 4 who could produce any document in the building within about 90 seconds. And Elphias Doge needed documents very badly. And she brought her filing cabinet with her. While the ministry was learning to govern again, the rest of the country was burying its dead. There were 53 funerals in the first 3 weeks of May. Harry Potter went to every single one that would have him, which was most of them, and he stood at the back in a borrowed black coat and shook hands with people who cried and told him that it was not his fault. Somewhere around the 11th funeral, he stopped being able to feel his own face. He was 17. He had no home because number 4, Privet Drive, had never been one, and he could not have gone back if he wanted to. He had no school because Hogwarts had a hole in it. He had no job because he had spent the year he should have spent taking his final exams living in a tent. He had a vault at Gringotts, an old dark house in London that had belonged to his godfather, and a house elf named Creature who had taken to cooking enormous meals nobody ate. And he had one other thing. On the 4th of May, in a bright cold house in a village outside London, Andromeda Tonks put a bundle into Harry's arms and told him to mind the head. Teddy Remus Lupin was 4 weeks old. His hair was the color of a bruised peach and changed to match the curtains when he got excited. His mother and father had both died at Hogwarts on the 2nd of May, 12 hours apart, and Harry Potter was his godfather because Remus Lupin had asked him to be in the kitchen of that same house in December, and Harry had said yes, without knowing what he was agreeing to. Andromeda was 52. She had lost her husband in March, her daughter in May, and her son-in-law in May. And she was now raising an infant alone in a house full of photographs. She did it without complaining once, and she did it badly some days, and Harry came 3 times a week and learned how to hold a bottle at the right angle. He was not good at it. He was 17, and he had no idea what he was doing. But he came on Tuesdays and Thursdays and Sundays, and by the end of May, he could get Teddy to sleep by walking him up and down the hall and talking absolute nonsense about broomsticks. And that was the first thing since the 2nd of May that Harry Potter had done that was not about a war. Remember Teddy? Everything that happens next happens because of Teddy. On the 22nd of June, 1998, Ophelia Trask put a folder on the desk of the interim Minister for Magic and asked for 20 minutes of his time. She had prepared it beautifully. That was her gift. She had a 2-page summary at the front, and behind the summary, she had the numbers. And the numbers were terrible. 63 magical children in Britain had lost both parents in the war. Another 140 had lost one. 19 magical estates had no living adult heir, which meant 19 houses standing empty and 19 vaults sealed and 19 sets of family obligations that nobody was fulfilling. 7 of the 50 chairs in the Wizengamot belonged to families with no adult heir and were being voted by proxies appointed years before. 406 children were currently living with grandparents over the age of 7. 60 of those grandparents had already written to the ministry to ask what would happen to the children when they died. Nobody was pretending these were not real problems. They were real. That is what made the folder so dangerous. Then Trask turned to the last section, and she explained, in her flat, pleasant voice, that there was an existing legal instrument that could resolve all of it at once. It was not new. It had been drafted the previous year by a committee of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. It had been fully costed. It had been checked for legal soundness. It only needed a signature. Elphias Doge read the summary twice. He asked 2 questions, and she answered both. Then the interim Minister for Magic, who had been in office for 5 weeks and had not slept properly in 3, signed a piece of paper he had not read to the end and went to lunch. The law was published on the 24th of June in a supplement to the Daily Prophet on page 9, under the heading that Ophelia Trask had written by lamplight at 3 o'clock in the morning on the 2nd of May. The Children of the War Act, 1998. The letter arrived at number 12, Grimold Place, on the morning of the 25th of June, carried by a ministry owl that would not leave until Harry signed for it. He signed. Then he sat down on the bottom step of the hall stairs with the envelope in his hands and did not open it for a while, because ministry letters in Harry Potter's experience had a poor record. It was 3 pages long. The first page congratulated him. The second page informed him that he had been classified. The third page gave him a date. Hermione Granger came back to Britain that same afternoon, and she came back thinner than she had left. She had spent 7 weeks in Australia. She had found a dentist named Wendell Wilkins and his wife Monica living in a bright flat in Melbourne with a view of a car park, and they had been perfectly happy, and they had not known her. Undoing a memory charm you have cast yourself is delicate work even when you are not doing it on your own mother. It had taken her 9 days. It had worked. That is the part that matters, and the part that hardly anyone says out loud. Hermione Granger walked into a stranger's flat and gave 2 people their daughter back, and she did it at 18, and she did it alone. What she had not expected was the fortnight afterwards. Her mother had headaches for 11 days and could not hold a spoon steadily for 4 of them. Her father had sat in a chair by the window and worked out, slowly and quietly, and without any anger at all, exactly what had been done to him and why. And then he had asked his daughter one question. He had asked whether she had considered simply telling them the truth and letting them decide. She had not had an answer. She still did not have one in June. Her parents were staying in Melbourne until Christmas. The healers Hermione had smuggled out to see them had advised against a long journey, and besides that, her mother had a practice there now, and her father had a garden, and there was something in the way they looked at England that Hermione had decided not to argue with. So she came home by herself, to a house in Hampstead with the furniture under sheets, and she went straight round to Grimmauld Place, because Ron had sent her an owl that said only, "Come at once, do not read the prophet on the way." She read the prophet on the way. By the time she reached the kitchen in the basement, Ron Weasley was sitting at the long table with the paper spread out in front of him and both hands flat on it, as if it might get up. Harry was standing at the far end by the stove, still holding his 3 pages. "Say it," Hermione said. "I've read it 4 times," said Ron. "It gets worse each time. That's not normal for reading." She sat down, and she took the act apart the way she took everything apart, and it took her 2 hours, and Creature brought soup twice, and she did not touch it. Here is what the Children of the War Act actually said, because the details are the whole story. Section 1 defined a child of the war. Any witch or wizard who had been under the age of 17 on the 24th of June, 1995, which was the day Voldemort returned, and who at the present date had no living registered magical guardian. That was the whole test. 2 conditions. The first condition caught everyone who had been at school during the war. The second condition was the trap, and it was a very old trap. Magical law had never recognized a muggle as the guardian of a witch or wizard. Not out of cruelty, originally. It had been written in the 1600s by people who genuinely could not imagine how a woman who could not light a candle with her hand could be responsible for a child who could set the curtains on fire while asleep. Nobody had ever bothered to repeal it, because nobody had ever needed it, because in practice, the ministry simply left muggle-born children alone and did not ask questions. Ophelia Trask had needed it. She had gone looking for it, and it was exactly where she expected it to be, which meant that in the eyes of magical Britain on the 24th of June, 1998, Hermione Jean Granger, aged 18, with 2 living parents who loved her, had no guardian at all. Section 2 established the register. 63 names. Section 3 was the one that did the damage. It gave the ministry the power to reconstitute the household of any person on the register. A child of the war under 17 would be placed with an approved magical household. A child of the war over 17 who held property, a vault, or a family seat would have that property administered under a household charter. And Section 3, subsection 4, explained what a household charter was. It was not new either. It was older than the guardianship law. In the days when the old families arranged the marriages of their heirs, the arrangement was recorded as a charter between 2 houses, and the charter bound the 2 named persons into a single legal household, with 1 shared estate, 1 shared set of obligations, and 1 shared vote in any assembly where either house held a chair. It had been the standard instrument for 400 years. It had fallen out of use in about 1870, when the last of the old families stopped being able to make their children obey them. It had never been repealed. "She didn't write a new law," Hermione said, sometime after 8 o'clock. Her voice had gone very flat. "That's what I keep getting stuck on. There's nothing in here she invented. Every single piece of this already existed. She went through the books and found the pieces that still worked and put them next to each other." "Is that better or worse?" said Harry. "It's worse," said Hermione. "New laws can be struck down for being unlawful. Old ones can't. They're already lawful. That's what old means." Section 4 listed the pairings. They were published on the 27th of June in the Daily Prophet, on page 2 this time, because by then it was news. 63 names, and beside 31 of them, another name. Some of them made a horrible kind of sense on paper. Two orphaned heirs of neighboring estates in Somerset, a boy from a family of broom makers, and a girl whose family had held the license to sell them. Somewhere in the ministry, somebody had sat with the register and matched vaults to vaults and chairs to chairs, and had felt, you can almost feel it in the arrangement, rather clever about it. Number 9 on the list was Susan Bones. She was 18. Her parents had died in the First War before she could remember them, and her Aunt Amelia had raised her. And her Aunt Amelia had been murdered in her own house in 1996 by Voldemort personally, because she had been head of magical law enforcement and had refused to be useful to him. Susan had inherited the Bones house, the Bones vault, and the Bones chair in the Wizengamot, and she had inherited all of it at 60. Beside her name was Theodore Knott. He was 18 as well. His mother had died when he was small. His father was a Death Eater of the old sort, the kind who had never gone to prison in the First War because there had never been enough evidence, and who had finally been caught in the Department of Mysteries in 1996 and was now serving a life sentence in Azkaban. Theodore had never been charged with anything. He had spent the last year at Hogwarts, keeping his head down so successfully that half his own year could not have told you what his voice sounded like. Number 41 on the register was Neville Longbottom. He was there under a different clause, subsection 9, which allowed the ministry to review a guardianship where the guardian was over the age of 70 or medically incapacitated. Augusta Longbottom was 86. Her son and daughter-in-law had been in a locked ward at St. Mungo's Hospital since 1981, and she had raised Neville herself from the age of 1, and the ministry proposed to review whether she was fit to continue. Augusta Longbottom received her letter on the 25th of June and had a solicitor in the ministry's offices by 10 o'clock on the 26th. He was an unpleasant little man named Paget, who had done work for the Longbottoms since 1953, and he arrived with 400 years of family records, a certified valuation of the Longbottom estate, 3 letters from Wizengamot elders, and a written opinion that any review of the guardianship would be met with a personal action against the reviewing officer. Neville Longbottom was struck from the register on the 30th of June. Nobody has ever pretended that was a coincidence. It cost the Longbottoms 400 galleons and 6 days. That is the sentence to hold on to, because it is the whole shape of what happened that summer. The Children of the War Act did not touch anybody who had a family with money and lawyers and an old name behind them. It only ever closed around the ones who had nobody at all. Number 1 on the register was Harry James Potter. Beside his name was Hermione Jean Granger. The date given for the constitution of the charter was the 1st of August, 1998. Hermione read it standing up in the basement kitchen, and Ron said her name twice, and she did not hear him either time. Then she put the paper down very carefully, as though it were made of something breakable, and she said one thing: "Why us?" It was the right question. It was better than every other question anyone asked that week, and it took them 9 weeks to answer it, and the answer was not what any of them expected, because Hermione Granger and Harry Potter had no property in common, no neighboring estates, no shared trade, no family connection of any kind. On the whole beautiful, efficient list of matched vaults and matched chairs, theirs was the one pairing that made no administrative sense at all. Somebody had chosen it on purpose. Harry Potter went to the Ministry of Magic on the 2nd of July to refuse. He did not make an appointment. He walked into the atrium at 9:30 in the morning when it was full, and he asked the witch at the security desk for the senior undersecretary. And within about 40 seconds, every person in that enormous hall knew who had just come in. They had rebuilt the fountain. The old one, the one with the noble wizard and the adoring creatures, had been smashed in 1996 and replaced by Voldemort's Black Monument, and that had been pulled down in May. What stood in the middle of the atrium now was a plain circle of white stone with 53 names cut into the rim and water running quietly over them. It was the best thing the ministry did that year, and it took them 9 days. Harry stood and read the names while he waited, because he could not think of anything else to do with his eyes, and about 200 people stood and watched him read them. Ophelia Trask came down herself. That was the first surprise. She did not send a junior, and she did not keep him waiting for an hour to establish who was in charge. She came out of the lift within 4 minutes, and she crossed the floor and she shook his hand. "Mr. Potter," she said, "I hoped you would come. Will you walk with me? The corridors are quieter." She was not what he had expected. He had spent all night building a picture of somebody like Umbridge, all sweetness and cruelty, and Ophelia Trask was nothing of the kind. She was thin and neat and slightly stooped from 30 years of desks. Her robes were grey and well kept, and about 6 years out of fashion. She spoke in an ordinary voice at an ordinary volume, and she listened to him properly, without interrupting, for 4 full minutes. Then she answered him, and that was much worse. "You are quite right that you did not consent," she said. "Nobody on the register consented. Consent is not a component of the instrument. I want to be honest with you about that, because I think you have been lied to a great deal, and I do not intend to add to it." "Then you already know it's wrong," said Harry. "I know it is unpleasant," said Ophelia Trask. "I am not certain those are the same thing. May I show you something?" She stopped at a window on the 2nd level. It was not a real window, of course, being several floors underground, but somebody in magical maintenance had set it to a grey drizzle that morning, and it looked out over nothing at all. There are 406 magical children in this country currently being raised by a grandparent over 70. She said, "I have the list. I read it in bed, Mr. Potter, which is a foolish thing to do, and I do it anyway. In 11 of those cases, the grandparent is over 85. In 2 cases, the grandparent has already written to us to ask what happens when she dies, and in 1 case, she asked whether the ministry would be so good as to make the arrangement now, while she was still able to explain it to the child herself." Harry said nothing. "I have worked in this building since I was 18 years old," she said. "I have watched 2 wars pass through it. I have kept the records for both. Do you know what I have learned? Everybody is very brave during the fighting, and nobody at all is brave afterwards. Afterwards, everybody is tired, and they go home, and the ordinary business of a country stops being done. Children fall through, houses stand empty, vaults are sealed, and nobody claims them, and 21 chairs in the Wizengamot sit empty while 29 exhausted people vote on the future of magical Britain." "So you fix it by marrying people off," said Harry. "I fix it by constituting households," said Trask. "The charter is a property instrument, Mr. Potter. It joins 2 estates so that one adult may administer both, and it fills a chair so that a family has a voice. I am aware of what it is called. I did not name it, and I cannot rename it. Because if I write a new instrument, it must go before the Wizengamot for a year, and those children do not have a year." "You could just ask us," Harry said. And Ophelia Trask looked at him with something that was almost affection, and said, "I did the arithmetic on that. If the act were voluntary, 11 people would sign. I know which 11. The other 52 would refuse, and in 4 years, the ones with nobody behind them would be exactly where the ones with nobody behind them always end up, and no one would remember that there had been a choice offered." Then she said the sentence that Harry Potter repeated to Hermione Granger that evening, word for word, because it had frightened him more than anything Voldemort had ever said to him. "You are not being punished," said Ophelia Trask. "You are being included. I understand that you would prefer to be exceptional. You have been exceptional your entire life, and it has cost you a great deal, and I'm sorry for it. But there are 63 names on that register, Mr. Potter, and I will not strike one of them off because he is famous. If I do that, I have written a law that only applies to the poor, and I would rather resign." She walked him back to the lift. At the doors, she said one more thing. "You are going to fight this," she said. "You should. If it cannot survive you, it does not deserve to survive. Do it in the chamber, Mr. Potter, not in the newspaper. The newspaper will not help you, and I would be sorry to see it hurt you." He did it in the newspaper. It was Ginny's idea, and for about 4 days it looked like the best idea anybody had ever had. Ginny Weasley was 16 years old that summer, and she had spent the previous year at a school run by Death Eaters, breaking into an office to steal a sword and being punished for it. She had lost a brother on the 2nd of May. She had written to Professor McGonagall in June to ask whether she might come back for her final year in January instead of September. She gave no reason, and McGonagall did not ask for one. Molly Weasley did not want her to do it and said so for 3 weeks, and then stopped saying it, because there was a chair at that kitchen table that nobody had moved yet either. So Ginny was in Britain all that autumn, which turned out to matter enormously. She had no patience left of any kind, and she had a very clear understanding of one thing that the rest of them kept forgetting. "They're not afraid of the law," she said, in the orchard at the Burrow on the 4th of July, with 4 Weasleys and Harry and Hermione sitting on the grass around her. "The law's theirs. They wrote it. They're afraid of the country. That's all any minister is ever afraid of, so we go and get the country." The interview ran in the Daily Prophet on the 6th of July, across the front page and pages 2 and 3, and it was, by any ordinary measure, devastating. Harry Potter, aged 17, described being classified by the ministry he had just finished saving. Hermione Granger explained, in language a child could follow, that magical law considered her dentist parents to be nobody, and asked whether the readers thought that was a law worth keeping. Susan Bones, who nobody had expected to speak at all, gave 4 sentences about her Aunt Amelia, and the 4th sentence made people cry on the night bus. 3,000 letters arrived at the ministry in 2 days. There was a crowd of about 400 people outside the visitors' entrance on the 8th of July with signs. The prophet ran a second story on the 9th. Elphias Doge gave an interview in which he said several times and with real distress that he had read the summary very carefully. And then, on the 10th of July, Ophelia Trask went to the Wizengamot and used all of it. She did not defend herself. That was the terrible thing. She stood in the middle of the stone floor with her folder, and she agreed with every word. She said that the public reaction had been immensely valuable. She said that it had demonstrated, more clearly than any report of hers could have, that the war's children were in a state of profound distress and had no confidence in any institution whatsoever. She read out 4 of the 3,000 letters, and she chose them beautifully, and every one of them was from a grandparent asking for help. She said that in her professional judgment, the act as drafted was insufficient. Section 3 provided for the reconstitution of households on a case-by-case basis with a right of representation at each stage, which meant a process of 18 months for 63 children. The public response demonstrated that 18 months was too long. She proposed an emergency extension, immediate placement of all registered persons under 17, with representations to be heard afterwards rather than before, and a new clause, Clause 11, empowering the ministry to review any guardianship where a registered person had been the subject of, and she read the wording out twice because it was her own and she was proud of it, sustained public agitation likely to prejudice the welfare of a child in the household. The Wizengamot passed the extension on the 10th of July by 19 votes to 8, with 2 abstentions. Tiberius Ogden, who was 89 and had resigned from that same chamber in protest 3 years earlier when it started using Dementors, stood up and spoke against it for 11 minutes. Griselda Marchbank seconded him. They lost. Harry Potter had gone to the country, and the country had answered, and Ophelia Trask had taken the answer and made the law bigger with it. On the 15th of July, 2 witches from the Office for the Placement of Magical Children arrived at Andromeda Tonks's house in Kent with a warrant under Clause 11. They were not cruel about it. This is the part people always get wrong when they tell this story. They were not cruel at all. One of them was called Miriam, and she was about 50, and she had done this job for 19 years, and she explained everything twice, and she cried in the car afterwards, and none of that made the slightest difference to what happened. The warrant said that Teddy Remus Lupin, aged 3 months, was a registered person under Section 2. It said that his registered magical guardian was a woman of 52 who had lost 3 members of her family in 14 weeks and had declined a healer's assessment. It said that the child's godfather, who visited the household 3 times weekly, had been the subject of sustained public agitation within the meaning of Clause 11. It said that the guardianship was suspended for 14 days pending assessment, and that the child would be placed in an approved household in the interim. Andromeda Tonks did not shout. She asked to pack his things, and they let her, and she put 4 vests and 2 blankets and a stuffed grey rabbit into a bag, and she stood in her own front garden while a woman named Miriam carried her grandson to the gate. Harry arrived at 4:20. He had been sent for by Owl, and he had run the last half-mile from the village because he could not make himself apparate accurately in the state he was in. He got there 11 minutes after they had gone. Andromeda was still in the garden. She had not moved, and when he started to say something about lawyers and Ogden and the Wizengamot, she stopped him with one hand and told him the only thing she had left to say that day. "Harry," she said, "sign it." He signed on the 17th of July in a small office on level 2, with a ministry quill and a witness who did not look up. It took about 90 seconds. There is no ceremony for consenting to a charter. There is only a form. Teddy Remus Lupin was returned to his grandmother on the 29th of July at 11 in the morning. The assessment found the household suitable. It noted that the concern under Clause 11 had been resolved by the registered person's compliance with the Act, which is a sentence worth reading twice, because it is the only place in the whole affair where the ministry wrote down what it was actually doing. Andromeda took her grandson back into her house and shut the door, and did not come out for 2 days. Harry sat on the step outside for a while, and then went home. Now, there was one moment in all of this when the Children of the War Act very nearly broke, and it is worth telling properly because it explains a date. On the 20th of July, Tiberius Ogden filed a challenge. He was 89 years old, and he had been reading statutes since before Ophelia Trask's parents were born, and he had gone back to the original text of the Household Charter, the real one, the version written in 1641, and he found something. The 1641 statute required both named parties to a charter to be of full age, and full age in 1641 was not 17. 17 was a wizarding convention that had grown up around the trace and the wand licensing rules 2 centuries later. In 1641, full age meant 18 years complete. Harry James Potter was 17 years old on the 20th of July, 1998. Ogden's challenge was elegant, correct, and completely useless, and he knew it when he filed it. Because Harry Potter's 18th birthday was on the 31st of July. Ophelia Trask did not contest the point. She conceded it in writing within 4 hours, thanked Elder Ogden for his diligence, and moved the Constitution of Charter No. 1 from the 24th of July to the 1st of August 1998. Hermione Granger had turned 18 on the 19th of September 1997 in a tent in a wood in Wales, and the 2 boys with her had between them 1 bar of chocolate, and they had given her all of it. So Ogden won. He won 9 days. Those were the only 9 days the opposition won all summer, and he took them because he had learned in 60 years in that chamber that you take the 9 days and you use them. Hermione Granger used them. She did not sign for 2 weeks after Harry did, and for the first 4 days of those 2 weeks she was going to run. She had it planned by the 21st of July, and it was a good plan because her plans always were. A portkey to Melbourne could be arranged privately for 200 galleons through a broker in Knockturn Alley who did not ask questions. Magical Britain had no extradition arrangement with the Australian Ministry for Civil Instruments. She was of age. She had a vault of her own, a small one, and enough money in it. Her parents were in Melbourne and her mother had a practice and her father had a garden. She would have got away with it too. That is the thing. Ophelia Trask had no power whatsoever outside Britain, and Hermione Granger could have spent the rest of her life in a bright flat with a view of a car park, and she would have been safe. She sat in the drawing room at Grimmauld Place on the night of the 24th of July, with the portkey broker's note in her hand, and Ron Weasley sat opposite her, and he told her to go. That is not a detail I would leave out for anything. Ron Weasley, who had spent 7 years being the one who was left behind, told her to take the portkey. He said it twice. He said that Harry would say the same, and that Harry would mean it, and that between the two of them they were quite capable of dealing with an old woman with a folder. And Hermione said no, and she gave him the reason, and the reason was the beginning of the end of the Children of the War Act. Section 8, she said. I've been reading Section 8 for 4 days. It's the boring one. It's about administration. Right, said Ron. A party to a household charter has a right of inspection, said Hermione. Over the whole instrument, not the summary, Ron, the instrument, every schedule, every appendix, every authority the drafters relied on, and the drafting record. It's in there because the old families used to sue each other constantly, and they all wanted to see each other's paperwork. Ron looked at her for a long moment. You're telling me the only person in Britain who's allowed to read that folder, he said, is somebody who's signed it. Yes, said Hermione. That's insane, said Ron. It's 400 years old, said Hermione. It was written by people who thought the worst thing that could happen to a charter was a dispute about a paddock. Then she folded the broker's note in half, and in half again, and she put it in the fire, and she watched it until it was gone, because she was 18 and not stupid, and she knew exactly what she was giving up. She was giving up Hogwarts. She had worked out that part on the 22nd. A person whose estate was administered under a charter could not enroll at a school without the written consent of the administrator, and the administrator was the Ministry of Magic, and the Ministry of Magic was not going to give written consent to the loudest muggle-born in the country going back for her final year and her nastily exhausting wizarding test results. Hermione Jean Granger, who had wanted since she was 11 years old to be the best student Hogwarts had ever produced, gave up her 7th year to get her hands on a filing cabinet. The charter was constituted on the 1st of August, 1998, at 9 o'clock in the morning in room 211 on level 2 of the Ministry of Magic. There were no flowers. Nobody has ever quite believed that, but there were not. The Act made no provision for flowers, and Ophelia Trask did not add any, because adding them would have been dishonest, and whatever else she was not that. Room 211 had a table, 6 chairs, a portrait of a 19th century registrar who slept through the entire proceeding, and a smell of old parchment and floor polish. A clerk from the Department of Magical Law Enforcement read the schedule aloud. It took 11 minutes and included a full description of the boundaries of a property in Godric's Hollow that had been a ruin since 1981. Harry Potter was 18 years old, and one day he wore the black coat he had worn to 53 funerals. Hermione Granger wore ordinary robes and had a bag over her shoulder that was heavy with quills and blank parchment because she had come to work. They signed at 11 minutes past 9, 2 names on a line, a seal, and a copy for the register. Ophelia Trask attended. She stood at the back with her hands folded, and she watched the whole thing, and when it was done, she said, "Thank you both. That was properly done." Then she left, and she went back to her office, and she recorded Charter Number 1 as constituted in her own hand, in a ledger she had been keeping since June. Ron Weasley waited in the corridor outside for the entire 11 minutes. He had not wanted to come in. He had been very clear about that. He came to the ministry and he stood in the corridor with his hands in his pockets and his ears going slowly red, and when the door opened, he was still there. And that mattered more to the two of them that morning than anything anybody said inside the room. The 3 of them walked out through the atrium together past the fountain with the 53 names, and a photographer from the Prophet got one picture, and it ran the next morning under a headline nobody in this story ever forgave. They went back to Grimmauld Place, because that was now, in law, the household. And in the hall, with the door shut and the umbrella stand watching, Hermione Granger said the thing that needs saying out loud in this story. And she said it in the flat, clear voice she used for facts. Right, before anything else. That paper joins two estates and it fills a chair. That's all it does. It cannot compel one single thing about how we live in this house. And if anyone ever tells you otherwise, they are lying to you, and I will take them apart. We are what we have always been. Nothing about that is theirs to write down. I know, said Harry. I know you know, said Hermione. I needed to hear myself say it in the building. Then she went down to the kitchen and she took out the blank parchment and she wrote at the top of the first sheet, in the small, tight handwriting she used when she was angry, a heading that read, Request for Inspection of Instrument, and underneath it she began to list in numbered order every single document she intended to make the Ministry of Magic hand over. There were 41 items on the list. The first item was the drafting record. The ministry took 5 weeks to answer her. That was legal. There is a provision in the 1641 statute allowing an administrator a reasonable period to produce an instrument for inspection, and reasonable in 1641 meant however long it took a man to ride to Norfolk. Ophelia Trask sent the documents in 6 batches between the 8th of August and the 11th of September, and each batch arrived with a covering note in her own handwriting, and each note was polite. 39 of the 41 items came. 2 did not. While Hermione read, the rest of the summer happened to everybody else, and it happened badly. On the 4th of August, Harry Potter's application to the Auror training program was frozen. The letter did not say refused. It said that the application of a registered person whose estate was under ministry administration raised a question of conflict of interest which would need to be resolved by the administrator before the application could proceed. The administrator was the ministry. The question was never resolved. The application sat in a drawer for the better part of 4 months. Ron Weasley's application was accepted on the same day. He came round to Grimmauld Place that evening with both letters in his pocket, and he put them on the kitchen table side by side, and none of the 3 of them said anything for about a minute. Then Ron withdrew from the Auror program. He did it on the 5th of August in writing, and he did not tell Harry or Hermione he was going to do it. And when they found out on the 7th, there was the worst argument the 3 of them had had since a tent in the Forest of Dean. Harry shouted. Hermione shouted, which was rarer and worse. Ron let them, and then he explained he had taken a different job. Level 2, Department of Magical Law Enforcement, Records and Writs. It paid 90 galleons a year less. It involved sorting warrants, filing depositions, carrying folders between offices, and knowing where everything in the department was kept. You've got the right to read the instrument, he said to Hermione. Fine, brilliant. What you haven't got is the right to read anything else in that building, and she knows it, and she'll give you exactly what the law says, and not 1 page more. So somebody's got to be inside. Ron, that's your career, said Harry. It's a filing job, said Ron. I'm 19 in March. I've got about 60 years. He shrugged, in the way he had, as though he were admitting to something embarrassing. Anyway, I'm good at it. That's the annoying bit. Turns out I'm quite good at it. He was. Within 3 weeks, Ron Weasley could tell you which of the 400 cabinets on level 2 held writs of committal by year, and which clerk went to lunch at 12:30, and which of the 2 lifts stopped at level 9. 2 floors up, in the minister's own office, his brother Percy was working 11-hour days for Ophelia Trask. Percy Weasley had run down a corridor at Hogwarts on the 2nd of May, shouting an apology at his own father, and had spent the rest of that night fighting, and had held his brother Fred's body with his hands. And then in June, he had gone back to work, because Percy Weasley did not know any other way to be a person, and because somebody at the ministry had to be honest. He did his job perfectly, and he said nothing to anybody for 11 weeks, and he read every document that crossed the minister's desk, and he understood a good deal more than he let on. Remember Percy, he's not finished. In the last week of August, George Weasley reopened the joke shop in Diagon Alley. He did it without any announcement. He unlocked the door on a Tuesday morning, and he swept the floor, and he sold a skiving snack box to a boy who did not recognize him, and he went upstairs and sat on the landing for half an hour. Then he came back down and did it again the next day. When Hermione needed 400 copies of a pamphlet printed in September, George printed them at cost and set the ink to sing very quietly when the pamphlet was opened in a public place, which was illegal and which sold out. Life in the household was stranger than any of them had expected, and mostly it was strange because it was so ordinary. There were 2 people in a house with 11 bedrooms. Hermione took the room on the second floor with the desk and the good window, and by the middle of August, that room was not a bedroom anymore. It was an archive. She had strung 4 lines of twine across it and pegged parchment to them in order, and she had a chart on the wall of every authority the act relied on, color-coded with dates. Harry cooked badly until Kreacher took it away from him with an expression of such profound personal offense that Harry apologized to him. And here is the thing about Kreacher that autumn, because it matters later. Kreacher had been the house elf of the House of Black for 60 years, and he had watched that family destroy itself, and he had loved them all the way down. Since May, he had been bringing things out of the attic. Nobody asked him to. He simply started doing it, an armful at a time, and he would not let anyone throw a single item away. Ledgers, bundles of letters tied with tape, inventories of silver, seating plans for dinners in 1911. He was building a den of it behind the boiler in the basement, arranged in a system that made sense to nobody alive, and when Harry once picked up a folder from the top of a pile, Kreacher made a noise like a kettle, and Harry put it back. Master's family papers, Kreacher said. Kreacher keeps them. Kreacher is keeping them until they's wanted. Kreacher, nobody's going to want a seating plan from 1911. Master does not know what he wants, said Kreacher with total confidence, and went back to sorting. On the 2nd of September, Hermione Granger sat down in a tea shop in Diagon Alley opposite Draco Malfoy. She had written to 11 old families in the middle of August. She needed to know how a household charter had actually worked in practice, not on paper, and the only people alive who knew that were the descendants of the people who had used them. 10 of the 11 did not reply. The 11th replied in 4 days, on heavy paper, in narrow slanting handwriting, and proposed a public place at an hour when the street would be empty. Draco Malfoy was 18. His father was awaiting trial. His mother had lied to Lord Voldemort's face in a forest in order to find out whether her son was alive, and the Malfoy name in September 1998 was worth roughly nothing. He did not apologize for anything, and Hermione did not ask him to. They had about 40 minutes, and neither of them wasted any of it. "You want to know about the chairs," he said, before she had finished her first question. "I want to know about the charter." "The charter's a way of moving a chair," said Draco. "That's all it ever was. Nobody joined 2 estates for the paddocks." He turned his teacup round on the saucer without drinking from it. "Do you know how the Wizengamot is actually composed? Not the version they teach." 50 members, said Hermione. "Appointed." 39 are appointed, said Draco Malfoy. 11 are not. And he told her, in about 6 minutes, a thing that was written down in no book she had ever been allowed to read. 11 of the 50 chairs in the Wizengamot chamber were ancient chairs. They were not appointments. They were attached to 11 named houses, and they had been attached since the chamber was founded, and they passed to the adult heir of the house, the way a vault or a ring did. If a house had no adult heir, the chair was held by proxy, and the proxy was appointed by the Wizengamot itself, and it stayed appointed until somebody turned up to claim it. Nobody claims them, said Draco. That's the point. Half those houses are extinct, and the rest can't be bothered, so the proxies just sit there voting year after year, and everybody's forgotten their proxies at all. My father held one himself for 6 years. Not the Malfoy chair. We haven't got one. We were never old enough. He said that last part with an odd, flat bitterness that had nothing to do with Hermione at all. Which houses? Said Hermione. Ollerton, Folly, Shafiq, Bones, Macmillan. He listed them without hesitating, the way another person might list the days of the week. Longbottom, Prewet, Slughorn, Oddly, Greengrass, Selwyn, Black. Hermione Granger put down her cup. Say the last one again, she said. Black, said Draco Malfoy. Extinct in the male line since 1996, held by proxy since 1997. He looked up at her, and for the first time in the conversation he looked interested. Oh, he said. Oh, that's rather good. He gave her 3 documents before he left. A certified copy of a household charter constituted between 2 families in 1806, with all its schedules. A copy of the Wizengamot's Register of Ancient Chairs as it stood in 1994, which his father had kept for reasons Draco declined to explain. And a note of the names of 2 clerks in the Department of Magical Law Enforcement who had handled the Malfoy family's charters for 30 years. Then he stood up and put on his gloves and said the only personal thing he said all afternoon. I'm not going to help you with this, he said. I want to be clear. My father goes before that chamber in November, and I am not going to stand up in it beforehand and be Draco Malfoy on your side of an argument, because it would cost him and it would not gain you anything. He pushed the documents an inch further across the table. But it's a filthy law, Granger, and my family invented most of the pieces of it, and I would rather it was gone. He paid for the tea. He did not send anything else, and he did not testify. And that is the whole of what Draco Malfoy did. Hermione Granger walked back to Grimmauld Place with 3 documents under her arm, and she did not open them for 2 days, because on the 4th of September, the last batch of the inspection arrived, and item 39 was the drafting record, and item 39 was a lie. It was 14 pages long. It recorded a committee of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement sitting on 8 occasions between March and June 1998 to consider measures for the welfare of bereaved magical minors. It listed the members. It gave the dates. It was clean, complete, and entirely plausible. And Hermione read it 3 times before she found the crack. The crack was in the schedule of authorities at the back. It was a list of every earlier document the drafters had relied on, and it was 40 items long, and 39 of them were statutes with proper citations. The 40th was a reference number, no title, no author, no date, just a string of letters and figures in the ministry's internal style. Commission Records, 1997, stroke, HRE, stroke, 4. Hermione Granger sat in a room hung with parchment on lines of twine at 9 o'clock at night on the 4th of September, 1998, and looked at 14 characters of ministry filing code and understood all at once that she had been asking the wrong question for 10 weeks. She had been asking who wrote this law. The question was when. The commission records were sealed. Ron found that out in 4 days, and it was the cruelest joke of the whole autumn. After the war, the Wizengamot had put a protective order over every file the Muggleborn Registration Commission had ever generated, and they had done it for the best reason in the world. Those files contained the names of 900 Muggleborn witches and wizards, their addresses, their families, their blood status as assessed by a panel, and in 211 cases, the place they had been sent. Nobody wanted that lying about in a public archive. So the Wizengamot sealed it all, every folder, for 50 years. The order that protected the victims protected the drafts as well, because nobody in June 1998 had thought to ask whether there was anything in those cabinets that was not evidence of a crime, but a plan for one. "I can't get it," Ron said, on the 9th of September in the basement kitchen, with his tie off and his sleeves rolled up. "I've looked at it from every side. It's not a locked door, it's a wall. Any clerk who breaks that seal goes to Azkaban, and I'd deserve it, because the first thing out of that cabinet is a list of 900 people's addresses." What he did get was 6 words in a corridor. He had been carrying a box of writs up to level 1 on the 11th, and his brother Percy had passed him going the other way with an armful of folders, and neither of them had stopped. Percy had said, without turning his head, and in the tone of a man reciting a filing reference to himself, "Commission material transferred to this office, June the 2nd. Then, he had gone on up the stairs. The commission's records were not in the sealed archive on level 10. They had been moved to the minister's own office in the first week of June, before the seal was applied, by the senior undersecretary who needed them for her folder. They were sitting in a cabinet about 4 feet from Ophelia Trask's desk, and they were not sealed at all, and there was still no way on earth to get at them. Which left one other route, and it was a horrible one, and it was Ginny Weasley who found it. There were 9 people alive who had sat on the Muggle-born Registration Commission. 6 had fled abroad. 1 had died in May. 1 was a clerk who had genuinely never read anything he stamped and could not have told you the difference between a statute and a laundry list. The 9th had been convicted on the 18th of August, 1928, in that same stone chamber, on 211 counts, and had been sentenced to life imprisonment, and was in a cell on the 3rd tier of Azkaban. Hermione applied for a visitor's permit under her right of inspection and was refused in 2 days. Trask's note was courteous and unanswerable. The right of inspection extends to documents and not to persons. She was correct. It does. So Ginny went to Rita Skeeter. Rita Skeeter was 46 and had spent the previous year writing whatever the occupying ministry told her to write, and was now in urgent need of having always been on the right side. She had full press accreditation, which permitted 1 accredited journalist and 1 registered assistant to interview a sentenced prisoner with the governor's consent. And she wanted one thing more than she wanted anything else that autumn. She wanted the Hogwarts year. Nobody had told it. For a year, the school had been run by Death Eaters, and the students had run something like a resistance inside it, and every one of them had come out in May and closed their mouths and refused to discuss it with anybody, ever, for any money. It was the biggest untold story in Britain. Ginny Weasley had been at the center of it. She had been 16 years old, and she had been punished in ways she never described to anybody, and she had never spoken one word about any of it, including to her mother. She sold it. 4 hours on the record, with names, in exchange for 1 registered assistant's pass to Azkaban, and no questions about who the assistant was. She did the interview on the 14th of September in the sitting room at the Burrow with the door shut. And Molly Weasley sat in the kitchen and heard some of it through the wall, and afterwards, Ginny came out and went up to her room and did not come down for supper. That is what the permit cost. It is worth knowing what things cost. Azkaban had no Dementors anymore. They had left in 1996 and gone to Voldemort, and after the war, nobody was mad enough to invite them back. So the prison was held by rotating shifts of auras and a great deal of very old stonework. It was better than it had been. It was still a black tower in a grey sea, and the wind came off the water at the landing stage hard enough to make a grown witch put a hand on the rail. They were allowed 30 minutes. Dolores Umbridge had made her cell tidy. That was the first thing Hermione noticed, and the thing she never got out of her head. There was a folded blanket and a comb set square on a ledge, and the prison robes had been pressed somehow, and everything was arranged the way a person arranges things when they are still expecting an inspection. She had lost weight, and she had lost her voice a little, and she was extremely pleased to have visitors. Rita Skeeter did the first 6 minutes, and she was very good at it. And Hermione stood behind her with a notebook and said nothing at all, which had been the arrangement. Then Rita said, in a bored voice, that of course everybody at the ministry was saying now that the commission had never really produced anything of substance. Just a great deal of paperwork, she said. No real policy, nothing that had lasted. And Dolores Umbridge sat up straight on her bench and said, "That is quite untrue." It took her 11 minutes to tell them, and nobody had to ask her more than 3 questions because she was not confessing. She was correcting the record. She was, in her own mind, the only person in the story who had ever tried to be organized. The commission had had a problem. When they committed a muggle-born witch to Azkaban, or when one fled the country, there was a household left behind. Sometimes there were children in it, magical children, who under the commission's own findings had no lawful claim to their magic and no lawful guardian. Sometimes there was a house and a vault, and in 4 cases, a family seat. The commission had no power to place children and no power to administer estates, and by November 1997, there were 41 of these cases stacked up, and nobody knew what to do with any of them. So Umbridge had asked her records officer to find her a mechanism. She was a very capable woman, said Dolores Umbridge, in a cell in Azkaban, with genuine warmth. One of the few. She came back in 9 days with the whole thing, and it was all existing law, every word of it, so there was nothing to pass and nobody to ask. The guardianship provision from 1663. The charter statute from 1641. She said to me, and I have always remembered it, she said, "Madam Undersecretary, we do not need a new law, we need a filing system." What was it called? Said Hermione Granger, and Umbridge told her. The Household Reassignment and Estate Continuity Order, 1997. Commission Records, File 4. Approved in draft in December 1997. Never brought into effect because in the spring, the Commission had rather more urgent business, and then, in May, the government had unfortunately fallen. 41 households, said Hermione, under the order. What was supposed to happen to them? They were to be reassigned, said Umbridge, with a small impatient movement of her hand, as though the answer were tedious. Placed with suitable families, the estates joined by charter, so that a responsible adult would hold them properly. It was rather elegant. I was sorry not to see it used. Hermione Granger stood in a stone corridor for the last 4 minutes of the visit and did not ask another question because she had stopped being able to make her voice work. The Children of the War Act, 1998, was not a law about the war's orphans that had been written bad. It was the Muggle-born Registration Commission's plan for what to do with the children and the houses of the people it had imprisoned, and somebody had drawn a line through the title at 3 in the morning on the 2nd of May and written a new one above it, and then carried it upstairs in June and put it in front of a kind old man who had not slept. They filed the petition on the 20th of September. It ran to 60 pages. It set out the provenance of the act, with Umbridge's evidence recorded under oath and signed, and the reference number from the Schedule of Authorities, and a comparison of the 1997 order and the 1998 Act clause by clause, which Hermione had done herself, and which showed 31 of the Act's 40 clauses to be word for word identical. Tiberius Ogden presented it in the chamber on the 1st of October, and he presented it magnificently. And it was thrown out in 50 minutes. 3 reasons were given, and here they are, because they are all completely fair, and that is the worst part. First, Dolores Umbridge was a convicted liar, serving 211 counts, whose evidence would not be accepted against a person's word on any other matter in Britain, and Ophelia Trask denied every part of it in writing within the hour. Second, and this was the argument that actually killed it, The provenance of a draft does not affect the lawfulness of an enacted statute. Trask's written answer put it in one sentence that was quoted in the Prophet for a fortnight. A wicked man's arithmetic, she wrote, is still arithmetic. The clauses had been examined on their merits and passed on their merits. Where they came from was a matter of history and not of law. Third, and this was the one that made Hermione Granger put her head in her hands in a corridor outside the chamber. The petitioner had no standing. She had brought it in her own name, and a party to a household charter whose estate was under ministry administration had no capacity to petition the Wizengamot, because the capacity to petition on behalf of that estate belonged to the administrator, and the administrator was the Ministry of Magic. Hermione Granger had spent 7 weeks assembling the most complete legal case anyone had built in that country in 50 years. And the chamber refused to hear it because in the eyes of the law, she was not a person who was allowed to speak in that room. Tiberius Ogden found her in the corridor afterwards. He was 89, and he had lost more votes in that building than most people had ever attended, and he did not offer her any comfort at all, which she said afterwards was the kindest thing anyone did for her that year. "Do not do that again," he said. "You have written the case. The case is finished, it is correct, and it will win. What you have not got is a mouth." "I don't understand," said Hermione. "Standing," said Tiberius Ogden. "You do not have it, so go and get it." Ron Weasley found it with a chessboard. He had been carrying folders around level 2 for 8 weeks by then, and he had a habit that his colleagues found funny, which was that he could not think about a problem without laying it out in front of him as pieces. So in the second week of October, he cleared the kitchen table at Grimmauld Place and set out 50 objects on it, one for every chair in the Wizengamot chamber, 39 buttons for the appointed members, 11 chess pieces for the ancient chairs, because Draco Malfoy's register of 1994 had given him the names. Then he started coloring them in. The vote of the 10th of July had been 19-8, with 2 abstentions. Ron had the division list because division lists are public, and any clerk in records and writs could fetch one without anybody blinking. Of the 19 who had voted for Ophelia Trask's emergency extension, 7 were sitting in ancient chairs. Of those 7, 5 were not heirs of anything. They were proxies. "Right," said Ron, on the 14th of October at about 1 in the morning, with Harry asleep in a chair by the stove and Hermione sitting opposite him with her chin on her hands. "Now, who appoints a proxy?" "The Wizengamot," said Hermione. "By its own committee. Malfoy's register says so." "Which committee?" Hermione went and got the register. The appointment of proxies to vacant ancient chairs was made by the Standing Committee on Composition and Precedence. The committee had 4 members, all of them Wizengamot elders, all of them entirely respectable, and it met twice a year to do about 40 minutes of work, and nobody in living memory had paid it the slightest attention. The committee did not keep its own records. It had a clock, and since March 1997, by a routine internal transfer of duties, which had been notified in the ministry's weekly circular on page 4 and read by absolutely nobody, the clerkship of the Standing Committee on Composition and Precedence had been held by the Records Office of the 4th level. Ophelia Trask's office. "She didn't appoint them," said Hermione slowly. "She can't have. She's not on the committee." "No," said Ron. "She wrote the papers for the meeting. That's all. She put 4 names in front of 4 old blokes twice a year, with a note saying these are the ones we suggest. And they said yes because they always say yes, because it's 40 minutes twice a year, and then there's lunch." He turned over the last of the 5 chess pieces. 5 votes, he said. "That's how she does it. Every single one of them is somebody her own office suggested. She's not corrupt, Hermione. I've been in that building for 10 weeks, and I'll say it in front of anybody, she's never taken a knut. She just noticed that nobody was watching the boring committee. and she's been quietly stacking 5 permanent votes in that chamber for 18 months, and the extension in July passed by 11, so without them it still passes." He stopped, "which is the bit that's been driving me mad since Tuesday." "Say it anyway," said Hermione. "The act itself," said Ron. "June the 22nd, Doge signed it, he didn't need a vote. But there's a confirmation. It's a formality. They do it for every ministerial order. It went through on the 26th of June, and it went through by— Hang on." He took a slip of paper out of his shirt pocket. He had clearly been carrying it around for days. 15 to 12, said Ron Weasley. 15 to 12 with the 5 in it. Hermione Granger sat absolutely still for about 4 seconds. 10 to 12, she said. 10 to 12, said Ron. It fails. If the proxies were properly appointed, the confirmation stands, and I'm wrong about everything. If they weren't, the Children of the War Act was never lawfully confirmed at all, and every charter under it is void from the day it was made, and there are 31 households in this country that have been living under a law that doesn't exist. They had the argument by the 15th of October. It was complete. It was, Ogden said afterwards, the finest piece of work anybody had done in that chamber in his lifetime, and he had been in it since 1934. And they could not say a word of it out loud, because there was still nobody in the room who was allowed to speak. They tried everything for 9 days. Ogden could raise it, but a member could only move on a matter of composition with the leave of the Chief Warlock, and the Chief Warlock's chair was vacant, and its powers rested with the interim minister, and the interim minister's papers were prepared by Ophelia Trask. They wrote to 14 appointed members. 4 replied. All 4 said the same thing in different words. Bring us a petitioner with standing, and we will hear it. Without one, we cannot. On the 24th of October, at about 8 in the evening, Harry Potter went down to the basement of number 12, Grimmauld Place, and stood in front of the boiler where a house elf had spent 5 months building a wall of paper. He had thought about it for 2 days first. That is worth saying. He had not gone down there in a rush of inspiration. He had sat upstairs and thought about the fact that he had lived in that house since May, and had been served 3 meals a day in it, and had never once asked the person who cooked them a question. Creature, he said, I need help. I don't know if you can give it. I'd like to ask properly. Creature came out from behind the boiler. He was very old, and his ears were going grey at the edges, and he was holding a duster. Master is asking Creature, he said. Yes. Master has never asked Creature for anything, said Creature. In 6 months. Creature has been waiting. Harry sat down on the stone step, because standing up while an elf a third of his height looked at him like that was more than he could manage. The Wizengamot, Harry said. There's a chair. It belongs to the House of Black. Somebody else has been sitting in it since 1997. And I need to know who it's actually supposed to belong to now. And every record in the ministry says nobody knows. And Creature of the House of Black put down his duster, and he said, the ministry does not have the deed. The ministry has never had the deed. Master Arcturus would not give it to them. He went behind the boiler. He was gone for 11 minutes. There was a sound of a great deal of paper being moved with enormous care. He came back with a roll of parchment about 2 feet long, sealed in black wax, wrapped in oilcloth, and he held it in both arms the way a person holds something that has been dropped once and never will be again. The Charter of Succession of the House of Black, said Creature, made in 1799, deposited with the Wizengamot, and withdrawn in 1806 and never returned, because Mistress's grandfather did not trust them. He put it into Harry's hands. Creature has kept it. Creature said the papers would be wanted. You said that in August, said Harry. You told me I didn't know what I wanted. Master did not, said Creature. Hermione Granger opened it on the kitchen table with 3 lamps round it, and did not touch it with her fingers. The Charter of Succession of the House of Black, 1799, was 11 pages of law in a hand so ornate it took her 40 minutes to read the first page. It set out how everything the family owned would pass, forever, and it had been drawn up by a man who was terrified of exactly one thing. He was terrified of the chair going out of the house. In 1799, the head of the House of Black had 4 daughters and no sons, and he could see quite clearly what was going to happen. His daughters would marry, and they would take the family's name off with them into other families, and one day the black chair in the Wizengamot would be sat in by somebody called Ollerton or Folly, and the house on Grimmauld Place would be shut up and sold, and the House of Black would be aligned in a register. So he wrote a rule to stop it, and he was very pleased with it. The chair said the charter of succession of the House of Black shall not pass by blood, it shall pass with the seat. Whosoever lawfully holds the house and hearth of the family, that person and no other, shall hold the chair of the House of Black in the Wizengamot, and shall hold it whether or not he bears the name. Whosoever lawfully holds the house. Sirius Orion Black had died in June 1996, and he had left everything he owned to his godson in a will that the ministry itself had upheld in the summer of 1996, when the ministry needed to know who owned it. Harry James Potter had held number 12, Grimmauld Place, lawfully and without any dispute at all, for 2 years and 4 months. The black chair had never been vacant. It had been sat in by a proxy for 18 months while its holder walked past the building in the street. "That's it," said Ron. "Harry's got a seat. Harry's got standing." "No," said Hermione. She had gone very white, and she was reading the 11th page, and she had one hand pressed flat on the table as though the room were moving. "Harry hasn't got standing," she said. "Harry's a registered person under a charter. His capacity over the estate belongs to the administrator. That's what they threw at me on the 1st of October, and it applies to him exactly the same way." "Then who has?" said Harry. Hermione Granger looked up from the table. "Section 3, subsection 4, she said. "The household charter, the 1641 statute. It joins 2 estates so that one adult may administer both, and it fills a chair so that a family has a voice." She said the last part very slowly. "One shared estate, one shared set of obligations, and one shared vote in any assembly where either house holds a chair. It's in the definition, Harry. It's in the first thing we read in June. It's why the instrument exists at all. It was written for houses that wanted their vote kept in the family when their sons married." The room was extremely quiet. "The charter names 2 parties," said Hermione Granger. "It doesn't rank them. It can't. In 1641, the whole point was that neither house lost its vote. Both named parties hold the household's vote jointly, and either may exercise it, and either may be heard in that chamber in respect of it." "So the ministry," said Ron very carefully, "when it made you a party to Harry's household." "Gave me half of the black chair," said Hermione Granger. "Yes." Nobody said anything for a while. Then Ron Weasley started laughing, and he could not stop for about a minute and a half, and it was not entirely a happy sound, because the man who wrote that rule in 1799 had written it to keep the chair of the House of Black away from women, and away from foreign families, and away from anybody who did not have the name. And 200 years later, his rule had worked exactly as he built it, and it had followed the house, and the house had gone to a boy whose mother was Muggle-born, and the Ministry of Magic had then bound that boy by charter to Hermione Jean Granger of Hampstead, whose parents were dentists. Ophelia Trask had spent 9 days in 1997 searching the oldest statute books in Britain for a mechanism to move estates and fill chairs. She had found one, and it had done precisely what she asked of it. Hermione Granger filed her claim to be recognized as joint holder of the chair of the House of Black on the 27th of October, 1998, at 4 in the afternoon. It was 11 pages long, and she had checked it 14 times. The claim was allowed on the 3rd of November, unopposed, because there was no possible ground on which to oppose it. Ophelia Trask read it twice, put it down, and wrote on the file in her own hand, "No objection can be sustained." Admit. She could have fought it. She had nothing to fight it with. She had built the whole thing out of law that was already lawful, and that was the entire strength of it, and it was also the reason it came apart in her hands. The country turned round in the third week of November, and it turned round because of two people who had every reason to keep quiet. Rita Skeeter's account of the year, The Death Eaters Ran Hogwarts, had run over 4 consecutive days in October, and it had been the most read thing the Daily Prophet printed that decade. And it had made Ginny Weasley, aged 17, a name in houses that had never heard of her. She had paid for that in ways that took her years to work through. She had also, without particularly meaning to, bought herself something she could spend. On the 16th of November, Rita Skeeter printed the provenance of the Children of the War Act across the whole front page, and this time she had a second source, and the second source was not a convicted prisoner in Azkaban. Percy Weasley resigned from the Ministry of Magic on the 13th of November at 5:20 in the afternoon in a 2-line letter. Then he went home to the Burrow for the first time in 3 months, and he sat at the kitchen table with his brother Ron, and he put down a copy of every meeting paper the Standing Committee on Composition and Precedence had received since March 1927, all of which he had been given to read in the ordinary course of his duties, none of which was secret, and every one of which had been prepared in the same handwriting. "I should have brought these in August," said Percy. "Yes," said Ron. "I want to be clear that I know that." "I know you know it," said Ron. "You're here in November. Loads of people aren't here at all." Percy Weasley gave evidence in the Wizengamot on the 19th of November, and did not once try to make himself look better than he was, and that is why the chamber believed him. The session was called for 11 o'clock on the 19th of November, 1998, on the motion of Elder Tiberius Ogden, seconded by Elder Griselda Marchbanks, on a matter of composition and precedence. Elphias Doge did not chair it. He had the right to. Instead, on the morning of the 18th, the interim Minister for Magic wrote to Tiberius Ogden and asked him to take the chair of the session, and gave his reason in one sentence, and it was the first entirely clear-eyed thing Elphias Doge had written since May. He said that he was, in the matter to be considered, a witness rather than a judge. The chamber had been filling up all autumn as new members were appointed, and 39 of the 50 chairs now had somebody in them. 5 of those 39 were left empty by order of the chair, pending the outcome, and that argument alone took 40 minutes. 34 members took their seats. The gallery held about 200 people. Andromeda Tonks was in the front row with her grandson asleep against her shoulder, because she had said that if they wanted to talk about the welfare of the child, they could look at him while they did it. And at 11:20, Hermione Jean Granger, aged 19 years and 2 months, took the chair of the House of Black, which had stood empty in the 3rd tier since 1996, and stood up in it to speak. Tiberius Ogden had warned her the night before. He had come to Grimmauld Place himself at 89 years old, and climbed the front steps and sat in the drawing room and made her say it out loud, because he did not believe a person should do a thing of that kind without hearing themselves say it. If the confirmation of the act was void, the act was void from the 22nd of June. If the act was void, every charter made under it was void from the day it was made. If charter number 1 was void, then Hermione Granger was not a party to any household, and the household held no chair jointly, and the chair of the House of Black reverted to the sole holder of the house and hearth, who was Harry Potter. The seat she was standing in would cease to exist the moment she won. She would speak in the Wizengamot of magical Britain exactly once, for about 90 minutes, and then never again, and she knew it when she stood up. "I have 1 vote," she said, "and I would like to spend it." She spoke for 82 minutes. She did not raise her voice once. She took the chamber through the schedule of authorities and the 40th citation. She took them through the 1997 order, clause by clause against the 1998 Act, 31 of 40, identical, and she read both texts aloud in parallel and let the chamber hear it. She took them through the guardianship rule of 1663 and asked the members to say out loud in that room whether it was the settled law of magical Britain that a mother who could not perform magic was nobody. Nobody answered her. She took them through the Standing Committee on Composition and Precedence, and the transfer of its clerkship in March 1997, and the 5 proxies, and the division of the 26th of June, 15 to 12, and the arithmetic that made it 10 to 12. And then she did the one thing in that session that she had not told anybody she was going to do. She took out of the front of her file a copy of the Daily Prophet from the 2nd of August, 1998, with a photograph on the front of 3 teenagers walking out of the ministry atrium past a fountain with 53 names on it. She had kept it for 4 months. She read the headline aloud in a level voice, and then she put the paper down and said nothing at all for about 6 seconds. That was the only silence in the whole session. The witnesses took 2 hours. Andromeda Tonks told the chamber about the 15th of July. She described 4 vests, 2 blankets, and a stuffed grey rabbit, and a woman named Miriam who had cried in the car, and she said that she did not blame Miriam and never had. She was asked whether the 14 days had been necessary for the assessment. She said that no assessment of any kind had been carried out on the child in that fortnight, that she had asked 4 times, and that she had the 4 letters. Susan Bones told the chamber that she was 19 years old, and that she had inherited a house, a vault, and the Bones chair at 16, and that she had been informed in June by a form that a stranger would help her look after them. She was asked whether Theodore Nott had behaved improperly towards her in any way. She said no, not once, not for a single hour, and that she was not going to be used to pretend that this had been about that, because it had not been. It had been about a house and a vault and a chair. Theodore Nott gave evidence for 11 minutes and did more damage than anybody except Dode. He was asked by a member on the second tier who plainly expected an easy answer whether he was content with the arrangement made for him. Under the charter, he stood to become joint holder of the Bones estate and the Bones chair, which was, for the son of a man serving life in Azkaban, the single greatest improvement in fortune available to anyone in Britain that year. No, said Theodore Nott. He was asked why not. Because I didn't earn it and she didn't choose it, he said. My father spent his whole life trying to get his hands on a chair in this room and he never managed it. This act would have handed me half of one in 6 weeks for nothing, because a clerk matched 2 names on a list. He looked up at the tiers. I don't want anything my father wanted. That's the only plan I've got. It's not much of one, but it's mine, and I'd like to be allowed to keep it. Ophelia Trask answered all of it in 26 minutes, and she very nearly won. She conceded the proxies. That was the extraordinary thing. She stood on the stone floor and agreed that her office had prepared the papers and that she had suggested the names, and that she had done it because the committee had asked her office for suggestions and no one else had ever provided any. She agreed the arithmetic. She said she had checked it herself on the 17th of November and that Mr. Weasley's figures were correct. Then she made her argument, and it was a good one, and for about 10 minutes the chamber went with her. The confirmation of the 26th of June, she said, was a formality. It always had been. Ministerial orders under the emergency statute took effect on the minister's signature. The confirmation was a courtesy that the ministry had extended to the chamber for 90 years and was not a condition of validity. The act had come into force on the 22nd of June when Elphias Doge signed it. Whatever the chamber thought of the proxies, and it should think about them seriously, and she would resign over them if asked, the children of the War Act stood on the signature of the Minister for Magic. It was correct. Tiberius Ogden said afterwards that he could not have answered it and that he had sat in his chair and felt the session slipping. And then Elphias Doge stood up. He was as old as Albus Dumbledore would have been, which is to say older than almost anyone alive. He was wearing the hat. He had to be helped to his feet, and he refused to speak from where he was and insisted on walking down to the floor, which took him 1 minute and 40 seconds, and nobody in that chamber made a sound while he did it. "My friends," he said, "I signed it on the 22nd of June. That is quite true. I want to tell you how." He told them. He told them about the 4,000 things needing deciding by Friday, and the summary at the front, and the 2 questions he had asked, and the answers he had received, which he said had been complete and truthful, and he wished that to be recorded. He said he had read the summary and the first 4 pages of the schedule. He said he had not read Section 3, Subsection 4. He said he had not read the schedule of authorities at all, and that he had not known, when he put his name to it, what a household charter was. "A signature," said Elphias Doge, "is not a formality when it is the whole of the thing. It cannot be. If my hand on that paper is what made the law, then the law was made by an old man who did not read it, and that is not government, and this chamber should not permit it to stand in my name." Then he said one more sentence, and it was not about law. "Albus would have read it," said Elphias Doge. "He would have read it in the corridor, and he would never have let it reach my desk, and I have thought about that every night since July." He walked back to his chair. It took him another 1 minute and 40 seconds. The chamber voted at 9 minutes past 4 in the afternoon on the 19th of November, 1998. The motion was that the confirmation of the 26th of June had been improperly composed and was void, and that the Children of the War Act, 1998, having been neither lawfully confirmed nor capable of standing on signature alone, was void from the date of its making. 26, 4, 8 against. Tiberius Ogden read the result out, and then had to read it again because of the noise in the gallery. And Hermione Granger sat down in the chair of the House of Black. And about 4 seconds later, she was not a member of the Wizengamot of magical Britain, because the charter that had put her there had stopped existing while she was sitting in it. She had one thing left to do, and she did it while the gallery was still shouting, by handing 11 pages of parchment up to the chair. Because voiding the act had done something terrible as well as something good. 19 children under the age of 17 had been placed in households in July under the emergency extension. Some of those placements were working. 2 of them were the best thing that had happened to those children in their lives. And at 9 minutes past 4, every one of them had become unlawful. She had seen it coming in October and had spent 3 weeks writing the answer. Tiberius Ogden read the heading out loud in a dry old voice, over a chamber that was slowly going quiet. A bill for the welfare and consent of bereaved magical children. The bill took 4 months, because good law always does. Tiberius Ogden carried it, and Griselda Marchbanks drove it, and it was drafted properly by 4 solicitors over 91 days, and the drafting was paid for by Augusta Longbottom, who wrote the check without being asked and refused to discuss it with anybody. Susan Bones clerked it. That was how she started, at 19, carrying files for a man of 90, and it is why her name is on things now. The Welfare and Consent of Bereaved Magical Children Act passed on the 9th of March, 1999. It did nearly everything the old act had claimed to do. It placed children who needed placing. It appointed administrators to 19 empty estates. It required the 11 ancient chairs to be publicly listed every year with the name of every proxy printed beside them, which put an end to that for good. It also repealed the guardianship rule of 1663 in 4 words, and magical Britain has recognized Muggle parents ever since. And it contained one clause that had nothing to do with estates or chairs, and that Hermione Granger wrote first, before any of the rest of it, on the night of the 15th of July, while she was waiting for Harry to come back from Kent. No guardianship shall be reviewed, suspended, or varied by reason of anything lawfully said in public by any person in the household. People call it the Tonks Clause. She never called it that. Ophelia Trask was removed from office on the 20th of November, 1998, and barred from public office for life. She was never charged with anything. There was nothing to charge her with. Every single act she performed between November 1997 and July 1998 was lawful at the time she performed it, and the inquiry that sat in December said so in the plainest possible language, and then spent 9 pages explaining why that was the most alarming sentence in its report. She sold her flat in February and went to live with her sister in Aberdeen, and she took 40 years of files with her because they were hers. In the last week of November, she sent Hermione Granger a note. It was 4 lines long. It congratulated her on the claim to the chair, which it described as the finest piece of drafting the writer had read in 30 years. It said that the clerkship transfer of March 1997 had been an honest administrative convenience, and that the writer accepted she should have declined it. It said that the writer did not accept, and would never accept, that the 406 children on her list had been better served by being left alone. Hermione kept it. She was asked once, years later, why, and she said that the day she threw that note away was the day she would start becoming the person who wrote it. Elphias Doge resigned as interim minister for magic on the 20th of November, the morning after the session, and lived another 2 years and was cheerful for most of them. Kingsley Shacklebolt woke up on the 4th of December, 1998, at about 6:30 in the morning in a private room on the 4th floor of St. Mungo's Hospital. Nobody ever found out why. The healers had tried 209 things across 7 months, and none of them had worked, and then a curse invented by a dead man simply finished running its course, the way a wound closes when the body decides it will. He was thin and weak and could not walk unaided for a fortnight. The first thing he asked for was the newspapers. All of them. Every issue since the 2nd of May. He read 7 months of his country in one afternoon in a hospital bed, and the healer on duty said afterwards that he did not speak the entire time, and that at about 4 o'clock he laughed once, very quietly, and would not say what at. He was appointed Minister for Magic by the Wizengamot on the 11th of January, 1999, by 41 votes to none. The first document he signed was Hermione Granger's bill, in drop, with 3 corrections in the margin, all of which she accepted. Harry Potter's application to the Auror training program was unfrozen on the 23rd of November, and he deferred it for a year. He gave a reason to exactly one person, and the reason was that Teddy Lupin was 8 months old, and that Andromeda Tonks was 53 and had buried 3 people in 14 weeks, and that there was going to be somebody in that house on Tuesdays and Thursdays and Sundays who was not 86 and not tired, and that the Auror office would still be there in 1999. It was. He started in September of that year, and Ron Weasley started with him, having been reinstated with his 8 weeks in records and writs counted as service, which he complained about for a decade on the grounds that it had been the hardest job he ever had. Tiberius Ogden offered Ron a permanent post in the Wizengamot's own office in December twice. "No thanks," said Ron Weasley. "I've had a look at the inside of that place, and I'd rather be outdoors." The charter of the household of Potter and Granger, being charter number 1 under an act that had never lawfully existed, was void from the 1st of August, 1998, and was struck from the register on the 24th of November. There was no ceremony for that either. There was a form. Hermione Granger stayed at Grimold Place until the middle of December because the second floor front bedroom still had 4 lines of twine across it with 11 weeks of parchment pegged to them. And you cannot move an archive in a hurry. Then she went to Melbourne for 3 weeks and spent Christmas with her parents, and her mother could hold a spoon perfectly well by then, and her father showed her the garden. She went back to Hogwarts on the 5th of January 1999. For the last 2 terms of a 7th year, she had already given up once, and she sat her nastily exhausting wizarding tests in June, and she took 11 of them, which the examinations authority had to write a special rule to allow. Griselda Marchbanks examined her personally in 3 subjects and told her afterwards, in front of a corridor full of 18-year-olds, that she had already sat a harder examination in November and passed it. Harry Potter and Hermione Granger had been made a household by the Ministry of Magic and were friends before it, during it, and after it, and it never became anything else. And the reason it never became anything else is that neither of them was ever willing to let a piece of paper choose one single thing about their lives. That is the whole of what the Children of the War Act achieved. It did not make a marriage. It made a precedent, and then it made a statute, and then it made nothing at all. There is one object left. In the library of the Wizengamot on the 9th level of the Ministry of Magic, there is a low glass case that visitors walk past without looking at because it holds a folder. The folder is thick with parchment and soft at the corners from being handled. It is open at the cover, and on the cover there is a title that has had a single careful line drawn through it. And above that line, in small neat letters, another title has been written in the same hand. They put it there in 2001, after an argument that lasted 8 months, and they keep the case lit, and they take every new class of ministry clerks past it in their first week. Both titles are still perfectly easy to read. That is the entire point of the exhibit. 1 law, 1 folder, 1 handwriting, and a single line of ink between the worst thing anybody in that building ever wrote and the kindest thing it was ever called. Thanks for watching. If this one got under your skin, the next timeline is one I have wanted to do for a long while, and it begins with Amelia Bones surviving 1996. See you there.